Welcome to today's 5-minute Bible study in the book of Daniel. Today we'll begin to look at Daniel chapter 5, which is the very familiar story of Daniel and Belshazzar. Belshazzar was the last king of Babylon. This is the famous incident with the writing on the wall. Now in chapter 5, we see the final chapter in the history of the Babylonian Empire. Chapter 5 describes the end of Babylon as an empire. Now just to sit through the dates so we understand clearly what's going on here. The book of Daniel begins in the year 605 BC, when Judah becomes a vassal state, a servant state of Babylon. It's also around 605 BC when Daniel, as a teenager, is carried into exile to Babylon, where he will spend the rest of his life. Then in chapter 2, where Nebuchadnezzar had his first dream, that's just a few years after that, probably around 602, 601, 600 BC. And then chapter 3, the delivery of the three Hebrew young people, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, from the fiery furnace occurs shortly after that, probably around 600, 599, 598 BC. And then in chapter 4, which was Nebuchadnezzar's second dream, the dream of the great tree, that occurs around 30 years later, probably around the year 570 BC. And as I've told you before in the previous session, Nebuchadnezzar's reign ends in 562 BC. Now the events in chapter 5 of Belshazzar and the last days of the Babylonian Empire occurred in 539 BC. So you see, this is some 31 years after the events of chapter 4. Now in the intervening years, since Nebuchadnezzar died, the Babylonian Empire had become weakened. Some of his sons ruled in his place for the first few years, but they were very ineffective. And finally, one of the commanders of the Babylonian army, a fellow by the name of Nabonidus, becomes the ruler, the king of Babylon, and he rules for the last several years of the Babylonian Empire. But during his reign, the Persian Empire to the east of Babylon is growing in power and are putting pressure on Babylon. So Nabonidus, the king, conducts a series of wars trying to resist the growing strength of the Persians. In the last several years of his reign, he actually did not live in Babylon, and he gave the rulership of the city of Babylon to his son, Belshazzar. So Belshazzar is really the ruler of Babylon in the stead of his father Nabonidus, who is off fighting the Persians in the field. That's why later on in the story, one of the rewards that Belshazzar offers to those who can tell him what the writing on the wall means, he says, "I'll make you third in power in the kingdom of Babylon." Remember, Nabonidus was first, Belshazzar was second. So when he offers third, he says, "You'll be just under me." Okay, that kind of sets the scene. But also lets us know that Daniel had lived in Babylon for a long time. He had first come as a young boy, teenager, 605 BC. And now in chapter 5, it's 539 BC. And the Babylonian Empire is about to come to an end. So he's been in Babylon now for 66 years. If he came as a teenager, that means he's well into his 80s at the very least. He's an old man who spent most of his life serving God in this land of Babylon. He has seen the whole history of the Babylonian Empire while he's been there. From Nebuchadnezzar's long reign to the ineffective reigns of his sons, now the reign of Nabonidus and Belshazzar. And now as this chapter begins, it is the last days of the kingdom of Belshazzar. The Persian army has defeated the Babylonian army in the field, and they have come to Babylon itself and besieged the city. But actually, even though they are under besieging from the Persians, Belshazzar is not afraid, because Babylon is a well-fortified, defended city. It has high walls, strong fortifications. He believes he can withstand the siege of the Persians for many years to come. And so he's not worried. As a matter of fact, the story begins with him throwing a great feast. Notice verse 1. Belshazzar gave a great banquet for 1,000 of his nobles and drank wine with them. And while Belshazzar was drinking his wine, he gave orders to bring in the gold and the silver goblets that Nebuchadnezzar had taken from the temple in Jerusalem. That was all those years ago. He said, bring them so that my guest may drink from them. It's an act of audacity and arrogance against the God of Israel. But it does not seem strange to you that when the city is under siege, that Belshazzar will be throwing this great feast and getting drunk and blaspheming the name of God, the God that Nebuchadnezzar had been converted to years before. Well, Belshazzar feels secure. Those strong walls of Babylon make him secure, but things are about to turn. God is about to intervene. So I hope you join us for our next session. We'll look how God intervenes with that miraculous event, the writing on the wall, what that means, and how the events unfold after that occurs. But we'll talk about that in detail tomorrow. So join us for our next 5-minute Bible study in the book of Daniel.